You guys know what an alpine coaster is? They are like a small roller coaster you find in the mountains. They're also called summer toboggans or mountain coasters, and I think there's some long German compound word they are called in parts of Europe. They are like a roller coaster, but with much smaller one or two person sleds you just sit on instead of multi-person cars you ride in. And instead of being built with like a scaffolding or a framework, the tracks are just on the ground, using the elevation of the mountain. Basically, it's a coaster track on the side of a mountain where you ride a sled down. They are pretty fun, or at least I used to think so. They are more personal than roller coasters, and although you get nowhere near the speed on them that you do on a good traditional roller coaster, and they can't do corkscrews or loops or anything like that, the openness and simplicity of the ride gives an impression of a much greater speed. You're just sitting there with nothing but a little plastic sled and the track between you and the ground as it goes zooming by. It's like the difference between how fast a go-kart feels compared to how fast a sports car feels. You know the sports car goes faster, but the open simpleness of a go-kart feels a different kind of fast. There's plenty of POV YouTube videos if you want to get the basic idea of what they are. I used to love alpine coasters. Used to. My family used to go to Gatlinburg and Pigeon Forge and up and down the Smoky Mountains for vacations when I was a kid, and they are common in that area, and I'd always rode them every chance I got. But as with so many things after I grew up and went to college, they just became part of my childhood that slipped away. They aren't exactly common once you get away from the mountains. Until one cool spring afternoon in 2004, I was in my final year at college, and I was driving back to campus in Tennessee after a short visit to my folks in North Carolina. It was only like a 4 or 5 hour drive via the most efficient route, and I had no need to be back at campus early, so instead of taking the freeway all the way, I got off and took part of my trip through the mountains. The scenery was nicer, and I admit I liked pushing my Camaro just a little faster than I should through the twisty mountain roads. Just after lunchtime happened upon one of those little by-the-highway tourist towns deep somewhere in the Smoky Mountains near the Carolina-Tennessee border. Nothing fancy. A gas station, truck stop, a diner, a couple of places selling tourist merch nestled deep in the mountains. I pulled into the gas station. My tank was getting low and I needed to stretch my legs, maybe grab something to eat. It was still early and I only had another couple of hours. I could kill an hour or so and still make it back to campus at a decent hour. I pulled into the gas station and was filling my tank when I happened to glance across the road and, well, I'll be damned. There it was. The Blue Ridge Alpine Coaster. Nestled on the side of the mountain was a building, a mock-up of a red barn, where a single-railed track that led up into the mountains where it soon got lost in the greenery. Wooden hand-painted standees of cartoon character bears dressed in stereotypical hillbilly get-up stood around, some of them holding signs showing the ride hours and ticket costs and other info. I had to admit, as silly as it was, it made me smile. I finished pumping my gas and, well, nostalgia is a hell of a thing. I decided then and there I could waste a little time riding an alpine coaster again after all these years before getting back on the road. I parked my car in a corner of the truck stop's parking lot, put my phone in the center console, this being the days before smartphones when people didn't keep their phones with them 24/7. And I didn't want my old Nokia brick phone to fall out during the ride, locked my car and walked across the mountain highway to the Alpine Coaster building. Getting closer, the place was less inviting. The half-hearted attempt at a whimsical faux Americana kitsch was far less effective when it brushed up against the actual decaying, run-down wooden building. Hell, calling it a building was generous. It was a wood frame holding up a long roof that covered the area where you got on the sleds. The wood boards creaked under my footsteps. The only real enclosed structure was a shack that held what I assumed was a ticket booth. A door on the side had both a single occupancy bathroom with an out-of-order sign on it. An old Pepsi machine buzzed and glowed next to it. Still, the place looked alive. Ahead of me, a bored-looking attendant was helping a mother and her young son into one of the sleds while in a bored monotone, repeating the safety brief. A few people were waiting in line at the ticket booth. Up in the mountains, the playful shouts of people on the ride echoed down. Fond memories of my own childhood rides flooded my mind. 10 minutes and $15 later, I was settling into the hard plastic seat of a bright red sled sat atop a simple aluminum rail. I couldn't help but grin as the sled slowly climbed the track up the mountains, making click-clack ratcheting sounds that hit my nostalgia centers hard. I felt good. The air was cool and crisp and smelled of pine. Higher and higher in the mountains we went. I don't know if this is my mind trying to make sense of it after the fact, but when I remember these moments, the last good moments, I sometimes think I remember a very slight, very subtle pit of fear in my stomach. I honestly don't know if I felt it at the time or not, or it's just how my mind tries to make sense of it looking back at. But either way, mostly I was enjoying myself. I smiled. I was a kid again. I could hear riders in front of me let out that initial yell of terrified glee you get at the first drop of any good ride. It peaked. I glanced around. I could see for miles, rolling hills and mountains. The sled tipped over and zoomed down the mountain, and I let out the same happy yell I heard from the other passengers. The ride zoomed down the mountain, catching speed. The mountain forest floor zoomed past, only a few feet under me. Trees zoomed past. I gave out a happy whoop as the ride banked hard around a curve and then looped back under itself. Another dip, another curve. I closed my eyes, enjoying the feel of the G-forces pulling me every which way. There was no one exact single moment where things started to go wrong. The ride kept going, and going. At this point, the first creeping thought entered my head. The ride was still going. It just started to hit me. This ride was going on for a really long time. I had taken a dozen rides on various coasters of this type before that day, and they topped out at about 5 minutes or so, and that was the long ones. Longer than a traditional roller coaster, but not that long. This one had been going on for what felt like 10, maybe even 15 minutes. I looked back over my shoulder and could only see trees, moving too fast to really get a bearing on where I was at in relation to anything. I wasn't exactly really worried yet. Okay, so I had found a particularly long alpine coaster. At the time, I wasn't 100% sure they didn't exist or anything like that. I was a little unnerved, but nothing was happening that was impossible. Yet. I was trying to talk myself back into just enjoying the ride and stop overthinking it, and halfway succeeded when, out of nowhere, I suddenly banked hard, the track jutting out almost over a sheer cliffside. I gripped the sled more tightly as I was whipped around. The ride then dipped hard and picked up speed, barreling down the side of the mountain. I was pushed back against the seat by the force of the drop. Jesus, I didn't remember them being this rough. I was feeling slightly nauseous. And where had this elevation drop come from, I wondered? I was still in the foothills, and I didn't remember seeing anything but gentle rolling hills and light drops from looking at the ride's route earlier. How the ride had managed such a long, steep drop in this area, I didn't know. For the first time, I hoped that the ride would be over soon. I had no idea then how much I would want that same hope to be true, so much more as time went on. With a whiplash motion, I was whipped forward and then back as the ride leveled out on flat ground again. But by this point, I was going fast. Too fast. My neck hurt from the mild whiplash, and I felt sour in my throat, and for a moment the contents of my stomach threatened to come back up. For the first, but hardly the last time the ride felt unsafe. Alpine coasters are tame affairs, much slower and gentler than full-on roller coasters, but this thing was throwing me around like no thrill ride I had ever been on. I looked around. I wasn't that deep into the woods. I should have been able to see a glimpse of something. The highway, the gas station, the tourist shops, the Alpine coaster office, something. Anything. But nothing. Just trees. I forced back some panic for the first time. I closed my eyes and counted to 10. The ride zoomed along. I counted to 60. I counted to 60 again. And again. Okay, this was getting uncomfortably harder and harder to explain. Suddenly, I noticed that up ahead, the track seemed to just end. For one brief, terrible moment, I thought the track just ended, But I was wrong. Almost without warning, the track dipped in an almost vertical drop. I almost screamed as I plummeted for 20, maybe 30 seconds before flattening out again. By this point, the voice in my head that was telling me something was wrong was louder, and I could no longer tell myself it was wrong. This ride could not have been this long. I tried to make sense of it, wondering if somehow I had gotten diverted onto some kind of maintenance track, or hell, for one brief irrational moment, even entertaining the idea that I had wound up on an actual train track somehow. But that was absurd. The rail below me was not a train track. It was still just the simple aluminum rail of an alpine coaster, and there had been no diversions or junctions in the track. I was still on the ride, as insane as that was starting to feel. Had the ride somehow looped? Again, after having the thought, I immediately dismissed it as crazy. There's no way I could have missed the ride building where I got on. And what kind of ride loops over and over? The sled zoomed through the forest, oddly never seeming to lose speed despite the relatively flat grade of the track. I cursed myself for leaving my phone in the car and not wearing a watch. I don't know exactly how long I had been on the ride at that point, but it felt like I had been on the ride for a half hour, maybe more. But time is a funny thing when you're in a situation you've never been in. Could have been more, could have been less at that point. My pride finally failed me. I started to scream for help. I screamed out that the ride was broken, to stop it, that I needed help. I did that for about 10 minutes or so, I think. The ride kept going, mostly flat, level track with occasional mild dips and turns. But the simple length of the ride grew more and more unnerving and unexplainable. I thought about just bailing out, but the ride impossibly was still not slowing down, and chunks of mountain rock and thick tree trunks were all around me. Bailing out without risking smashing into a rock or a tree seemed impossible. The ride kept going. Up ahead, the forest was clearing out some. I could see the forest brightening, more sunlight making it through the canopy. I wasn't prepared for what I saw. The trees stopped, and I had just enough time to take in a flat, open area of rock, maybe 40, 50 yards at most, before another sheer cliff. The tracks twisted and turned and then shot straight down, but that wasn't the worst of it. For a moment, a very short moment, I had a clear view for miles, and the landscape was, to be blunt, totally impossible. Any possibility that I had just stumbled on some incredibly long ride was blasted out of my head. Barren, volcanic-looking rock stretched for miles. Jagged, black, rocky outcroppings as far as the eye could see. I was in the goddamn Smoky Mountains. They don't look like that. I had a few moments for the terror of that view to settle in before the cart plunged into another horrifying drop. I gripped the handles of the cheap plastic sled until my knuckles turned white. The drop felt completely vertical, like I was falling at terminal velocity. I screamed. My stomach dropped and turned. I imagined the sled coming away from the track and me just plummeting, screaming to my death on the rocks below. But somehow the ride still functioned. I closed my eyes tightly and just waited for whatever was going to happen. Eventually, after several what felt like a full minute of steep plunging, the track again leveled out, and I opened my eyes to see myself moving at breakneck speed over that black, rocky landscape. Now that I was moving on a more or less flat horizontal track again, I took a few deep breaths. I looked over the edge of the track. Nothing but that black, jagged rock, almost looking like obsidian, zooming past. I had no idea how fast the sled was moving now. Fast. Faster than a gravity-powered sled should be moving, and the track was higher off the ground now. Alpine slides usually stick pretty close to the ground, but I was 20 feet or so in the air, the track suspended in the air, a simple metal tube tower like a power pylon every few yards. Without any immediate threat, and the sled moving fast but steadily and level, I was able to think about my situation again, for all the good that did me. Ahead of me, the track just continued to the horizon, nothing but the same rocky landscape as far as I could see. I craned my neck to look back over my shoulder, and looked back behind me, and it looked the same. Even the mountains were but distant specks on the horizon behind me. This was insane. There's not a giant, seemingly endless field of black, jagged rock in the goddamn Smoky Mountains. There's no cliff faces tall and steep enough for a multi-minute vertical drop. And alpine coasters were small affairs, not major engineering projects that span miles with pylons and vertical tracks. It made no sense. Sadly, it wasn't going to start making any more sense anytime soon. The ride kept going. I was on this rocky landscape for several hours. I feel comfortable saying this because I could actually notice the sun getting lower in the sky, and the sled wasn't slowing down despite the grade of the track being flat. I was getting cramped from sitting and stretched my legs and twisted my back as best I could. Didn't do much help. My eyes were starting to get irritated from the constant wind in them. Worst of all, it was starting to get chilly. I only had on a light jacket, a windbreaker, just something to keep the breeze off me, no real insulation. I was cold, my joints were stiff, I was hungry and thirsty. My eyes watered and my throat was so dry it was sore. But none of that was as bad as just how little sense this all made. There's nothing like this place anywhere near the Smoky Mountains. This was like some volcanic rock landscape. The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. The ride kept going. My mind didn't even try to process this. Whatever I was experiencing simply couldn't be possible. I was crazy. I was dreaming. The CIA had kidnapped me and dosed me with some new version of LSD, and I was in a straitjacket in a padded room at Area 51. The sled kept zooming along as the sky turned to dusk. Soon the bridge disappeared from my view and I continued on along the endless, rocky, featureless landscape. I sat back against the sled, mentally and physically numb. I was exhausted. I was thirsty. I was cramping up. I was hungry. I had to pee. I held it for as long as I could, then had no choice but just wet myself. I cried until I had no more tears left. Then I just sat there. The ride kept going. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, my throat felt like sandpaper. I dug around in my jacket pockets, hoping to find a stick of gum or piece of candy. Nothing. I checked again, having nothing else to do. Under a crumpled store receipt in the inner pocket of my jacket was a single old, forgotten cough drop. I unwrapped it from the paper and popped it in my mouth. Saliva flooded back into my mouth and I was overwhelmed by the methanol and medicine taste. It was something at least, although I knew it would be a brief and temporary fix at best. I felt my eyes get heavy. It was getting colder, that mountain cold. That deep cold the mountains have even into the early spring when the sun goes down. That kind that just pulls the heat right out of you. I shivered. A terrible, horrible certainty came to me. I would ride until I passed out from exhaustion or the hypothermia set in. My body would tumble off the sled to fall and skip across the rocky ground like a stone skipping across a lake, my bones breaking as I tumbled until my body finally came to a stop. If I was lucky, I would be killed and not have to lie for days, broken and bruised on the ground until death took me. The ride kept going. The ride kept going. The fucking ride kept going. Fuck you, I said to the ride, my voice a hoarse whisper. I pulled my jacket closer around me for all the good it did. The cold wind was slowly but surely pulling my body heat away. My shivering got worse, crossing the line from a simple, normal shiver into those deep, almost violent, full-body ones. I wasn't anything you could call an experienced outdoorsman, but I knew enough to know that wasn't a good sign. It was getting dark. There was a full moon at least, so I wasn't totally in the dark. About then I noticed something. The landscape, what little I could see in the fading light, was changing. It was smoothing out, becoming less rocky and craggy. Up ahead, an odd, shimmering light was starting to appear on the ground. I was over it before I even realized what it was. The tracks were going over a smooth surface. Water. It was a lake. The odd lights I had seen were the moon, reflected in ripples on the lake. Within minutes, I was out of the view of the land. After the nearly endless rocky landscape and everything else I had seen, it scared me how little I was shocked. I didn't like how mentally numb I was getting. I leaned over. There was enough moonlight to see the water, 15 or 20 feet below the track. The pylons holding up the track went into the water. The light wasn't good enough to even make a guess at how far they went down, or how deep the water was. I leaned back in the sled. My eyes were red and bloodshot from the constant wind. I closed them. This was a mistake. I jerked awake. I don't know if I dozed off for a split second or an hour. My weight had shifted and I caught myself as my center of gravity was in danger of sending me off the sled and into the water. I screamed in anger, a deep primal scream. I hurt so bad. My joints felt like they were full of glass. My limbs were full of pins and needles. I glanced over at the water. For the first time on the very edges of my brain, a tiny voice started to speak up, telling me that I could be all over if I just jumped. I shut the voice up, but it scared me still. I sat there as the ride went on. It felt like hours. Eventually, the lake ended in a rocky shoreline. The damned ride. There was no safe place to bail out. If the ride slowed down, it was high in the air. If it moved toward the ground, it sped up. Sharp rocks, big trees, nothing you could safely bail out into. I kept having to force myself awake. I kept dozing off. Once I felt myself falling asleep and drove a vicious uppercut into my own nose to stave it off. I seriously started to think about how much longer I could hang on. The voice came back again. This time I didn't shut it up. I wasn't admitting it to myself yet, but I was starting to think about the best way to land that would end it quickly if I needed to. Something was ahead. The track seemed to dip into the ground. I was too tired, too beaten to even get scared. I was just resigned to whatever happened at this point. With little warning, the track took my sled into a tunnel in the ground. Everything went completely pitch black. After several moments, even the dim moonlight was gone. This was the worst part. The creepy forest, the immense rocky landscape, the eerie lake. Those were bad. But this was just nothing. Nothing to look at, nothing to hear, nothing for reference or sense of where I was going. The walls of the tunnel felt like they were inches from me in every direction. The air felt thick, like there wasn't enough oxygen. With every moment I was in that tunnel, I lost a little more hope. After a long, long time, I made a decision. When I got out of this tunnel, I would jump. I didn't care anymore. Hopefully there would be a spot where I could be certain the fall would instantly kill me. I was done. The ride had beaten me. I sat there waiting for a chance to end this on my terms. That was all I had left. Eventually up ahead, a tiny speck of light appeared. I gathered my strength, ready to end it. I sat up, getting my legs under me so I could jump as soon as we were clear. The sled burst out of the tunnel. The dim light of the full moon was enough to be momentarily blinding after the pitch black of the tunnel. I gave my eyes a moment to adjust. I was back in a normal-looking Appalachian forest. Rolling hills, green trees. The air smelled of pine again. I heard an owl hoot off somewhere. Slowly, I lowered myself back into a setting position in shock. At first, I refused to believe it, but the ride was slowing down. I held still, making sure my mind wasn't playing tricks on me. But no, the cheap plastic sled that had been my world for what felt like an eternity was slowing down. Up ahead, a structure was visible, peeking out from among the trees in the dim lighting as the sled moved down the track. It was the Alpine Slide building, the crappy fake red barn where I had boarded this cursed ride so long ago. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, sure it was either my mind or the cursed ride playing tricks with me. But the building stayed there. It grew closer and closer. The track leveled completely out. The sled slowed down more. Before I had the time to really come to terms with it, I arrived back at the building. The sled slowed to a stop, gently pumping against another sled parked on the track. I sat there for a few moments, gasping in great, big, gulping fear breaths, trying to assure myself the ride didn't have one last trick of its sleeve. I looked around. The place was empty, deserted. The overhead lights were still on, and the old Pepsi machine still glowed and buzzed, but the ticket booth was dark and empty, a metal gate pulled down over the ticket window. Suddenly it hit me that I was free, and I practically leapt out of the sled and onto the platform. I immediately collapsed. My legs were jelly and my head was spinning. I tried to stand up again and doubled over, dry heaving. Have you ever been out on a boat for a day and have that weird reverse motion sickness when you're back on solid land? It was like that times 100. My inner ear was literally pounding. All the motion had really done a number on it. I laid there for a few moments and eventually forced myself to stand up on my two wobbling legs. I looked around, a horrible certainty creeping into my mind that there would be no exit, no way off the platform, but to my relief, an exit turnstile, one of those full-height ones, was set into the fence that surrounded the ride property. I went through it and found myself back on the main road. The truck stop was still there, still open but far less busy. My car sat in the same corner of the parking lot I had left it. I allowed myself one look back, just one quick one. The metal skeleton of the Alpine slide track sat there, dark and quiet but otherwise normal. I stumbled, ran back to my car, dug the keys out of my pocket, and collapsed inside. When the door shut, I let out a primal scream, the tons of fear and confusion and anger all fusing into a single raw emotion. I screamed again and again. After a few moments, I felt like I was emotionally at least back to a place where I could act, although I wasn't sure yet what to do next. Not really knowing what to do, I cranked the car. The AC had been on low when I shut off the car, and it came roaring back to life, and cold air blowing on me almost sent me back into a full-on panic attack. I fumbled with the climate controls until the air stopped blowing directly on me, then calmed down enough to turn the heat on, helping to get the chill out of my bones. There was a half-full bottle of water in the center console cup holder, and I grabbed it and chugged it. Nothing ever tasted as good before, or since as that few ounces of water. That was when I noticed the clock on the radio head unit. It was 4:17 in the morning. It had been about 1:30 or so in the afternoon when I got on the accursed ride. Over 15 hours. I had been on the goddamn ride for over 15 hours. Over half a day. I just sat there, warming up, calming down. I was exhausted. I was dehydrated. I can't even describe how my head felt. I probably had at least a minor case of hypothermia. I thought about going into the gas station and asking for help, but what would I even say? And more than anything, I just wanted to get away from this place. And I just wanted to get away. I wanted to be nowhere near that damn ride. I put the Camaro in gear and pulled into the street, and in panic I immediately slammed on the brakes. I was lucky there was no traffic on the road at that moment. The feeling of accelerating to just normal surface street speeds made me sick to my stomach. I gathered myself and very slowly accelerated the car I usually treated with a very heavy foot up to 30 miles an hour. Every time I tried to accelerate at a pace faster than old lady going to church uphill, I would have a panic attack. I was okay once I was up to speed, but accelerating freaked me out after being on that ride. I drove about 30 minutes, putting some arbitrary amount of distance between myself and the coaster. Eventually, I made it back to where the twisty mountain road met back up with a major road that would eventually meet back up with the highway. After a few more minutes of driving, I saw the on-ramp for the highway. There was one of those big truck stop travel plazas and pulled in, parking right up at the door. I smelled like pee, and I can only imagine how I looked. But I didn't care. I kept a couple of emergency 20s in the back of my wallet and spent it on the biggest bottle of water the store had, an overpriced bottle of eye drops, and a huge travel mug of coffee. The clerk looked at me as if he was expecting me to either drop dead or rob him the entire time. Back in my car, I downed the coffee. I put a few eye drops in each of my eyes and sat there as the caffeine took effect until I felt like I could make it back to my apartment. The sun was just coming up when I finally pulled out of the truck stop and got on the freeway. I slowly, very slowly, accelerated up to highway speed, put the Camaro in cruise control, and let the miles start to drift away. I turned on the radio. I needed to hear human voices. Every time my mind went back to what had just happened, I turned the radio up louder, eventually drowning it out with painful levels of rock music. I wasn't ready to think about it yet. Yes, looking back, I know I was just in denial. I finally made it back to the crappy little apartment I had off campus, a little 2-story walk-up studio. I let myself in and collapsed on the cheap couch. I was asleep before I even had the time to decide whether or not to do anything else. I woke up later that afternoon. I took a shower and ate a meal and didn't think about the ride. I washed the pee-stained, filthy clothes I had been wearing and didn't think about the ride. I went back to class and didn't think about the ride. Every time I thought about the ride, I forced it out of my head. I'm sure this wasn't the most mentally healthy thing to do, but what can you say? I didn't forget about it, don't be silly. This isn't the kind of thing you forget. One day, while looking up something else in the university's library, my curiosity got the better of me, and I looked up the Alpine slide. No website, but a few Google Map and Yelp mentions. None of them mentioned anything weird, certainly nothing even remotely like what I experienced. Near as I can tell, it closed sometimes in the winter of 2012. Life went on. I mean, that's what it does. The next day was a little better, and the day after that a little better, and the day after that a little better still. I met a nice girl, graduated, got married, got a nice house in the suburbs, got a dog, had a daughter, spent a lot of time happy and not thinking about being trapped on an endless alpine coaster. And that was my life for many, many years after that. Until a few weeks back when, as a very different person, I found myself driving a boring and safe mid-sized family SUV through those same mountains. My wife Carol, 5 months pregnant, sat in the passenger seat, our 6-year-old daughter Emily in a booster seat in the back, and Max, our mixed-breed mutt, next to her. It had been a nice, pleasant trip, driving back from visiting her folks. I hadn't thought about that fucking ride in so long. I barely registered that I was in the same general area until it was too late. Suddenly, I realized that little mountain tourist trap town was only a few minutes down the road. I swallowed hard and gripped the steering wheel hard. Carol was looking out the window at the scenery, and Emily was deep into some kid's YouTube video on an iPad. I forced myself to keep my breath steady as we rounded the corner. The town was still there, sorta. Time had not been kind to it. The gas station was still there. At some point it had been bought out by Shell. The tourist trap shops were still there. One of them was now a vape shop. The diner was closed, the building looking like it sat unused for a long time. But of course that's not what I cared about. I looked over at the site where the Alpine coaster once stood. It was gone. The kitschy fake barn was gone. The site was just a bare concrete slab with a chain-link fence around it. Faded no trespassing and for sale signs hung off the fence. A pile of old, decaying lumber that might have once long ago been part of the structure-covered part of the old lot. No sign of the track remained outside of some old concrete support posts dotting the side of the mountain. I exhaled out a breath I hadn't even realized I had been holding in. Soon the little town disappeared in my rearview mirror. About a half hour later, we stopped for gas. I pulled up to a gas pump across from a massive motorhome. Max stuck his head out the window and started barking at a little white dog, a toy breed of some kind, in the window of the motorhome. Carol and Emily immediately headed into the store to restock on snacks while I fueled up. I stood there, a half smile on my lips as Max barked and wagged his tail in an attempt to attract the attention of the other dog while I filled up the tank, said dog doing an admirable job of ignoring him. Right about the time I finished fueling up and cleaning the bugs off the windshield. Carol returned from inside the store, Emily in tow, arms filled with 2 full-sized bags of salt and vinegar potato chips and what looked to be a half-dozen individually wrapped pickles. I raised an eyebrow at the collection of food, but knew better than to question a pregnant woman's snack choices. "Should we take Max for a quick walk?" Carol asked. The travel plaza had a nice little gated dog walking area off to the side. "Yeah, probably not a bad idea. He's been cooped up in the car for a few hours," I said. Max, upon hearing his name and the word walk, forgot about the other dog and upgraded from wagging his tail to wagging his entire body while making whining sounds and staring right at me. About this time I became half aware that the big motorhome next to us was pulling away. I didn't think much of it, outside of doing a quick automatic mental check to make sure Emily was well clear of the moving vehicle. But she was safely between me and our SUV, well out of the way. But that was when Emily looked behind me and cheerfully yelled, "Daddy, look, a roller coaster. Can I ride the coaster?" It's cliche as fuck, I know, but my blood went cold. I turned around slowly, certain in my knowledge that terrible old decrepit alpine coaster would be there, having just popped into existence to trap me again. That is not what I saw. Sure enough, there was a coaster there, one I hadn't noticed earlier because it had mostly been blocked by the motorhome, but there it was. It was even an alpine coaster. But it was not the same coaster I had encountered those years ago. That was immediately obvious. It was a small but modern and newish looking setup with neon lights and a bunch of people. There was an actual building where you bought tickets and a little snack stand. "Daddy, can we go on the coaster?" Emily asked again. My mouth made motions, but no words came out. I glanced over at Carol, hoping she'd say we didn't have time, but to my horror, she smiled and said, "You know what? That does sound like fun. Daddy will take you while I take Max for a walk." My mind raced, trying to think of a way to get out of it. But Emily was already dragging me across the parking lot to the entrance. I patted my pocket, making sure my phone was in it. Every fiber of my being was screaming to run away. I walked through the line and the ticket booth while Emily bounced happily. We got into a 2-seat plastic sled. This one was actually a lot nicer than the one my mind wouldn't stop thinking about. It had 2 nice cushioned seats, big grab handles, even a nice roll bar. The sled started up the track. I fought back the panic. I swerved my head around, keeping the building in my view. I was terrified of losing sight of it. We made it to the top, and Emily did a happy squeal as we started down the side of the mountain. My heart raced. Any second, my mind told me we'd lose sight of the building, and then the ride would never end. The ride sped down the mountain. My mind tortured me with thoughts of not only going through it again, but seeing Emily go through it. The ride went around a big banking turn. Emily kept shouting happily. How long before Carol reported us missing, I wondered. Could I keep Emily calm? What if it lasted even longer this time? What if this time it never ended? And then we were back at the start of the ride. The same attendant who had helped us into the sled was helping Emily out. I stepped out. The attendant gave me a brief look but said nothing. I guess I looked a little wild-eyed. I was fine. Emily was fine. It had been a perfectly normal, fun ride. That was fun, Daddy, thank you, Emily said. I forced a smile back. It was fun, I responded, hoping I sounded like I meant it. I took Emily's hand, and we walked back to the car. Max saw us coming and barked happily. Carol looked up from the pint of Ben & Jerry's she had somehow acquired and added to her snack collection while we were gone and smiled at us. Did you have fun? She asked. It was so fun, Mommy, Emily said. Carol smiled down at her, but then looked at me and frowned. Are you okay? Carol could read my face a lot better than the attendant could. You're pale. I smiled, and this time the smile felt real. You know what? Yeah, I think I'm okay. Carol looked a little puzzled, but didn't press it. We loaded Emily back in her booster seat, stopped Max from trying desperately to eat half a discarded gas station hot dog off the ground, and got him back in the car. Carol and her small collection of snack food took her place in the passenger seat, and I got in the driver's seat. I smiled. I cranked the car. I put it in gear. I pulled out of the gas station and back on the road, this time accelerating just a little faster than I had in years. Now that Mom and Dad are dead, I need to tell the truth about Jamie. I swore I'd take the secret to my grave. That was before the accident, though. Their car crashed on Saturday, see? Exactly a year to the day since Simon Kincaid got fried in the electric chair. I thought keeping the truth to myself, sparing my folks the agony of the truth, was the right thing to do. That was a terrible, terrible mistake. I can't sleep unless I know someone else knows what really happened. I'm not looking for forgiveness, atonement, or even freedom from your judgment. I can't carry the secrets anymore. Jamie is, or rather was, my older brother. A fair bit older, too. 5 years. I was 100% the little sister that only existed to save a marriage. It worked, by the by. Mom and Dad bounced back from borderline divorce when I was born. and they were together right up until their Honda Civic plowed off of that bridge. For a while, we actually had the perfect family. Then came the day Jamie told me about the hole. I was 12, he 17, both nearing our birthdays. It was summer, and a hot one. 104 on the Mercury when we grabbed our bikes to ride out to the hole. Jamie had found it earlier in the week when he and his idiot friends were quad biking the trails in Herbert's Woods. Unbeknownst to Jamie, they'd also been only half a mile away from the outdoor encampment of off-grid paranoid shut-in Simon Kincaid. This alone was enough to seal his fate. When he first found the hole, Jamie didn't have the gear he took to the indoor climbing place every other weekend. That's why he wanted to come back with me a week later, to climb down it. I pointed out to him that a hole in the forest isn't the same as an indoor climbing wall with safety fall mattresses and instructors, etc., and he told me to shut up and stop being a butt munch. I still miss him. I'd give anything to hear him call me any one of those dozens of 90s playground insults again. It was an hour of solid cycling before we reached the hole. I'd never been that deep into Herbert's Woods before. Not that I knew it in that blistering summer afternoon, but I never would again either. Well, that's not technically true. I did go back once to show the police and my frantic parents where I'd last seen Jamie. Jamie's idiot friends, Ben and Adam, were waiting for us with Adam's truck. The beaten and rusted '88 Comanche was essential for Jamie's plan to explore the depths of the hole. The pickup's tow bar would act as an anchor for the rope, and Adam and Ben would pick up the spare slack cord, using it to lower Jamie down by hand. My role in his scheme was being there because Mom and Dad were at work, so Jamie was saddled with me for the day and had to include me whether he wanted to or not. If I wanted to look back with rose-tinted glasses, I could say Jamie also thought it could be a brother-sister bonding experience. I know deep down that's not true, though. I also don't deserve the privilege of viewing that, say, through any lens other than the stark, harrowing truth. I was nervous even before we got deep into the forest. Herbert's Woods had a reputation in the schoolyards of our small town. Had done for generations. Murderers lived in Herbert's Woods, didn't you know? So said the various classroom rhymes and playground songs at least. Any local kid could tell you about the sprawling miles of towering evergreens and how they were home to escaped lunatics from the St. Dionysus mental institution a few miles out of town, near the larger settlement of Marathon. I was too old to admit I still believed in the urban legends, but not old enough to be unspooked as the trees and shadows around the dirt path grew thicker and thicker. I had to keep convincing myself the noises I could hear coming from the dense undergrowth and rustling foliage had normal, wholesome nature documentary explanations. For the first time in my life, I was actually grateful to see my older brother's two dumbass sidekicks. It was early evening, and the canopy of tree branches overhead was thick enough to mute the dwindling sunlight to near darkness. The glare of the '88 Comanche's headlights was a welcome reprieve as far as my preteen resolve was concerned. Not that I let Jamie or his moronic adolescent stooges see this, of course. When Ben asked if I was scared, I gave him the finger. Then Jamie punched him on the arm and knocked the can of beer out of his hand, which was nice. The last big brotherly thing he ever did. Ben and Adam were thick as the gnarled trunks and roots surrounding us, but Jamie was smart. He'd brought along plenty of rope and flashlights, and even a set of walkie-talkies. After I informed him I'd tell Mom he brought me along to Herbert's Woods too. If he didn't, Jamie agreed to let me be the radio operator while the other two lowered him. He had his longest rope, 80 meters. He explained before showing me the hole that their flashlight beams didn't reach the bottom, but a stone they chucked down there had hit solid ground. Jamie refused to disclose how long it took for the echo of this stone landing to drift back up to the surface. He assured me it couldn't be any deeper than 50 meters, though. When I asked him how he'd figured that out, he told me, "Shut up. That's how." My first question when I finally saw the hole was why on earth Jamie wanted to climb down it. My second was if there was anything I could do to stop him. There wasn't. My bluff of threatening to actually tell Mom this time was countered with a do-it-then turd wipe. He knew I wouldn't. I was his 12-year-old little sister. I was too young to rebel of my own accord, but old enough to want my rebellious teenage brother to think I was cool. That's why I gulped and took the walkie-talkie from his hand, instead of convincing him to come down from the literal ledge as I should have. The hole didn't look natural. It wasn't a sinkhole or the entrance to a cave system. About 7 feet in diameter, the perfect circle was a sheer drop into murky nothingness. It lay about a 5-second walk from the dirt track in a small clearing. Adam and Ben had spent all day clearing enough bushes to get the truck as close as possible to the rim, although their efforts had done little to detract from how cramped and claustrophobic this patch of bare earth in the near-solid blanket of trees felt. Jamie was right about the hole being deep too. My flashlight revealed nothing but more darkness when I pointed it over the smooth lip of the hole. As I said, perfect vertical drop. The earth and dirt of the walls were compressed so tightly that it looked more like clay. Shaft is perhaps a more appropriate word now that I think about it. Actually, no. Shaft sounds too innocent. It was a hole. A gaping, yawning, abyss stares back at you hole. Why did Jamie want to climb down it? Because it was there, and because he could. And, as far as my 12-year-old self was concerned, because boys were stupid. Jamie was one of those kids, though. Mom and Dad got him into indoor rock climbing as an outlet after, well, a few incidents of trespassing on quote-unquote abandoned factories that nearly got him a record. If we'd been born 20 years later, he'd have had an Urbex channel on YouTube. By his reckoning, the hole might be an old well with a dead body from pioneer times at the bottom, or it might be the entrance to an unfinished nuclear bunker. Either of these near certainties would be, in his exact words, cool as Satan taking a shit on a Metallica meets Iron Maiden mashup album cover. That was enough justification for Jamie, and I'd learned very early in my childhood there was little point arguing once he started making weirdly specific 80s metal references. After getting harnessed up, Jamie instructed me to go and wait by Adam's truck. Because of our near-constant sibling bickering, he was visibly surprised when I didn't argue. I told him in no uncertain terms that the hole creeped me out. Jamie called me a baby, then Ben decided to join in. Difference is, the two words Ben chose to call me began with a P and a B, and definitely weren't words Jamie could stomach hearing directed at his little sister. That's the exact moment life as I blissfully knew it ended. Jamie saw red, but Ben had been standing on the other side of the 7-foot hole, out of punching range. My older brother did the first next thing his suddenly enraged mind could think of. He picked up the heaviest fallen tree branch within arm's reach and hurled it at Ben. A direct hit. Jamie could bench 100 pounds. He grunted when he picked up that log. It wasn't light. It was no surprise at all that Ben went cross-eyed when the wood bounced off his head, especially when a thin red river immediately began pouring from the fresh wound just above his hairline. I didn't start screaming at Jamie because of the blood. I started because when Ben's knees buckled, he swayed, turning in the air mid-collapse and fell, straight into the hole. As Jamie pointed out after the 5 minutes it took to calm me down, my wailing meant we didn't hear Ben hit the bottom. He could have got stuck, though. He could be fine. But the only way to know would be if Jamie went down the hole. My brother was absolutely positive about that. To Jamie's credit, even though there were tears in his eyes, and he was clearly terrified, he didn't think twice about jumping into the yawning void to rescue his friend. He also immediately took responsibility for his fuck-up, as evidenced by his lack of retaliation when Adam knocked the wind out of him with a gut punch. The three of them went all the way back to kindergarten. I think that's why Adam stayed instead of jumping straight into his truck and going to the cops. He knew Jamie, and he knew Jamie had never intended to actually hurt Ben, let alone possibly kill him. He also knew Jamie's aim wasn't that great. The chances that the log hit Ben's head for any reason other than sheer fluke were slim. Jamie had royally screwed up, but Adam wouldn't snitch on him, at least not until they'd tried to rescue Ben, or, although none of us said it out loud, had confirmed he was dead. And so Jamie was lowered into the hole by Adam as planned. Now, though, the stakes were much, much higher than a simple testosterone-fueled desire to explore dark, forbidden spaces for no reason. Face covered in tears, still sniveling, I took my place leaning against the hood of the truck. My knuckles were white tight around the walkie-talkie. Even all these decades later, I can still clearly remember how much I prayed in my head that the knot around the tow bar of the rusty '88 Comanche would hold. I almost begged Jamie not to lower himself any further once everything below his navel had vanished from sight. Almost made one last attempt to stop my brother from descending down that smooth, perfectly circular chasm. I almost, but I didn't. Instead, I gave a final loud sniffle while I watched Adam let loose more of the rope to help Jamie disappear into the earth. My brother caught my eye as he abseiled the last few inches with his head still above ground. When all that remained was his nose, brow, and hair, he actually found enough composure to throw me a reassuring nod. Before I could return it, though, he was gone. My heart was getting its first experience of real intense cardio, the kind of shit soccer moms pay $200 a month on spin classes to achieve. I kept having to convince myself that my fears Jamie wouldn't reemerge from the hole were just that. Just fears. Me being a baby because that's who I was in all this. I was Jamie's baby sister. My palms were moist, but nowhere near as wet as my tear-stained cheeks. I managed not to scream again, though. For a little while longer, at least. If I'd known just how accurately prophetic my apprehension was, however, I'd have opened my mouth and let forth a howl so loud every bird in Wisconsin would be shaken from their trees. I didn't know, though, did I? I still trusted my cool older brother's almost genuine bravado. That's why instead of screaming, I did as instructed and spoke to him on the walkie-talkie. He abseiled down the hole slowly, despite every second counting if Ben had any hope of being recovered alive. This was the very early 90s, remember? No cell phones. As dumb as Jamie's rescue attempt was, it was still a faster bet than trying to find a payphone. The first 5 minutes were filled mostly with Jamie rambling to keep himself focused. He apologized over and over, to me, to Adam, to Ben, to Mom and Dad. It was all he could do not to spiral into a panic attack at the realization he may have just caused the death of one of his closest friends. There was more than one, "Shit, I'll be facing hard time for this, I'm going to die behind bars" moment too. I tried my best to hide my sobs and sound calm when I responded, but I don't think it did much good. I wasn't calm. I was in shock, weak-kneed, and on the verge of puking. I also found it difficult to placate Jamie's worries when my older brother's assessment was pretty much bang on the money. He had possibly killed Ben. He would more than likely face jail time for murder. Every "it'll be okay" was a massive lie, and the increasing tempo of the ragged breaths between his words confirmed to me that he knew it. Ben's fall happened so fast. Our day went from building childhood memories to birthing lifelong trauma in the blink of an eye. Jamie's descent was equally traumatic as Ben's tumble, but it was anything but instant. Every second listening to his crackling voice on the handset felt a lifetime long. I don't know which I prayed harder for in my head, that the rope wrapped around the '88 Comanche's rusty tow bar held, or that Adam's teenage arms didn't buckle under the strain. Both worst-case scenarios looked imminent more than once. Every creak of Adam's truck made me yelp. Every groan he made twisted a fresh knot in my gut. When the worst did eventually happen, none of my foreboding predictions prepared me for it. I wasn't even close. Some conversations stick with you clear as crystal no matter how many years pass. My final one with Jamie before the hole took him hasn't faded even a fraction of a percent, despite 30 years having gone since. "How far down are you now, idiot?" I sniffled into the receiver, not knowing it would be the last question he'd ever answer. About 55 meters, I think," came Jamie's hiss-pop feedback-heavy response. "I thought I'd be at the bottom by now." "I told you it was deeper than you thought, dick for brains." I laughed wryly into the walkie-talkie, trying and failing not to show how far from funny I found the situation. Jamie's return attempt was just as pathetic.
Well, maybe if you knew how to talk at a human pitch, my ears could hear your words. You helium huffing. You can hear me now, dumbass. Then I couldn't hold it in any longer. Jamie, I'm scared. Please tell Adam to pull you back up. He's running out of slack rope. I want to go. What's happening down there? Are you? My babbling was cut off by a sharp hiss from the walkie-talkie. Shut up, dingus. I think I found the bottom. Yeah, I found the bottom. Sure enough, the rope in Adam's hand had gone from Golden Gate Bridge support cable to wriggling at the lip of the hole like a beached earthworm. Adam immediately sunk to his knees when the tension of Jamie's weight released. Face red and veiny arms limp. He didn't let go of the rope, though. A fatal error. The crackling voice of Jamie didn't stop either. There's a big like a cave or something down here, but it's like square. Jamie, what's going on down there? I yelled at the black box in my hand. Can you see Ben? The walkie-talkie said, Ben, are you down here? Fuck, man, fuck, it's so dark. This flashlight isn't doing shit. Ben, Jamie, what's happening? Have you found? My tear-choked questioning was cut off by a loud, shrill microphone feedback-pitched scream. Jamie's scream. It didn't come from the walkie-talkie, though. It came from the hole. Jamie, I yelled again. Both the hole and the walkie-talkie clenched tight in my sweaty grip. Jamie, are you hurt? Jamie, talk to me, Jamie. Pull me up. 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 I found Ben. Oh, God, I found Ben. Pull me up. He's open. I can see his fucking shit. Tell Adam to fucking pull me up, right? There was a long pause, during which I could hear nothing but static. I kept yelling Jamie's name, but just before I nodded to Adam to start pulling him up, my older brother's voice returned on the radio waves. It was a single word. Wait. Jamie noticed something that snapped him out of his overwhelming panic spiral. I didn't have to ask what. It's Ben. He didn't survive the fall. No, duh, he didn't, but there's a lot of blood. He died when he hit the ground. I can see where he landed, but it's not where he is. There's a trail like something dragged his body over. Then the second scream came from the hole. This one wasn't Jamie. It wasn't even human. The pitch of the half snarl, half shriek that geysered from the wound in the earth oscillated far too fast to be human. I would say the second scream was bestial, animalistic, but even that doesn't feel right. Growing up in a small, semi-rural town surrounded by woodlands, you get used to animal sounds. Some are frightening, sure, and many conjure images of unspeakable nightmares when heard by unaccustomed ears. No animal I've ever heard, even the ones that were fighting, fucking, or dying, made noises that sounded like that second scream. It was so loud a horde of cawing birds swarmed from the tree canopy into the orange sunset beyond. Like they knew this thing we disturbed wasn't of the forest, and their mocking crowing was a big old, I told you so. The abyssal screaming from the hole lasted a full 10 seconds. Probably doesn't sound that long to you reading this as mere pathetic words on a screen, but you weren't there. You don't know. If someone told me Adam and I stood there listening to that ragged shrieking for an entire century, I'd have believed them. I only realized how hard I'd been clenching my jaw and fists during the howl by how much they suddenly heard when it stopped. The silence that followed felt almost as long as the maddening roar itself. Then from the walkie-talkie came the last words I ever heard my brother say. Don't tell Mom I brought you with me. Tell her I snuck out. I shouldn't have. Whatever he'd seen down there, whatever had screamed at him in the darkness at the bottom of the hole, it had left him in a state of instant detached dissociative shock. For comparison, even the sight of his best friend's decimated corpse, a body he himself created, didn't destroy Jamie's psyche as fully and totally as whatever his flashlight was revealing. I don't know whether this is fortunate or unfortunate, but he didn't live long enough to tell me what it was.
The rope dangling over the lip of the hole sprang back into iron rod tightness. Jamie's voice on the headset was ripped into static near silence by a short, sharp burst of ringing feedback. Adam, his blistered hands still wrapped tight around the rope, lurched forward and over the edge of the pit. I finally let myself scream that bird-disturbing scream I mentioned. Too bad the crows had already had the sense to flee. It was chaos, and all of it happened at the same moment. Before I could make sense of any of it, though, the 88 Comanche I'd been leaning against was pulled toward the hole by the rope, just like its owner. Since I'd had all my weight against it, I was pushed violently by the sudden shift of the 3-ton vehicle. I fell forward, the smooth, clayish lip of the darkness rushing toward me. I closed my eyes, awaiting the spray of air whistling past my face. I heard the twang of the last of the rope getting sucked into the hole, and I realized Adam had already been yanked to his doom by the same impossibly strong pull from its other end. The pull that was using the climbing rope to reel in the rusted pickup truck like a sea bass. In the slowed-down adrenaline time of my fall, my expectations went from the pressing rush of plummeting into the void like Jamie, Adam, and Ben to feeling the crush of an 88 Comanche pinning my body into the earth. Neither horrifying sensation came. Instead, before I knew what it was, I felt the grip of a hand on my shoulder. Simon Kincaid's fate was sealed the moment he decided to set up his makeshift off-grid encampment in Herbert's Woods. If he'd chosen to live on any of the other 1,000,000 square miles of unclaimed wilderness, he wouldn't have been close enough for the police to pin everything on him. He also might not have been close enough to hear the almost alien scream from the hole. He definitely wouldn't have been close enough for his evening jog to bring him along the same dirt path Adam's truck was fiercely wrenched from at the exact moment it was wrenched. And of course, it goes without saying that I would with absolute certainty be dead right now if Herbert's Woods hadn't felt homely to Simon Kincaid when he was seeking a new place to live barely 6 months earlier. Simon Kincaid saved my life, and he paid for it with his own. I've had to learn to live with that this past year. Honestly, I'm not sure how much longer I can. If it wasn't for me, he'd never have Jamie's blood on his hands, both in the eyes of the law and literally. I was near thrown out of the way of the truck just in time. Instead of plummeting into the hold, I landed in a sobbing heap beside it. There was a loud final thunk from the rusted tow bar, but amazingly it held. This crunch of defiant steel was accompanied by a last twang-ang-ang-ang from the rope before it fell still and lifeless. My memories start to get hazy after this. I remember pointing at the hole, remember screaming, "My brother, my brother, my brother," over and over again. I remember the dirty, borderline homeless hero who'd saved my life retracting the worryingly slack cord from the circular void. What do I remember most, though? Obviously, what I remember most is the dark red liquid dripping from the torn end, when the last of the dangling length was finally pulled into the daylight, considerably less than 80 meters later. I barfed when I saw it, all over Simon Kincaid, which is how my DNA got on his clothes. Handling the blood-soaked rope was how he got Jamie's. The cycle ride home has always been a blur, even as it was happening. So were the various police interviews or conversations with my parents in the weeks and months that followed. I didn't stop to speak to Simon Kincaid, or even thank him. I just wanted Mom. Unfortunately for Mr. Kincaid, he'd wake up the next day to find a SWAT team surrounding his trailer in the forest, the barrels of their guns all aimed directly at him. From that day on, he would never be a free man again. I was there when they gave him the chair. I thought I owed him that much, for him to die with someone who knew the truth present, someone to validate his innocence as he entered the next life. He didn't agree when he saw me through the glass. I've never heard anyone swear like that. When I led them to the clearing, the circular chasm had vanished. All that remained was a patch of condensed, almost clay-like earth, one that none of the officers seemed to want to look at for too long. However, a bit of ground that gives people heebie-jeebies is hardly admissible evidence in court. Since there was no hole anymore when the police found Adam's truck, nobody believed my story. When I realized the cops, my parents, Adam's mom, and especially Ben's town councilman father wanted to believe Simon Kincaid had killed the 3 boys, I started agreeing with, Fuck, what have I done? I've had 30 years to try and rectify this. Nobody believed Simon Kincaid's story either. Until the day he died, he was a guilty, monstrous, evil individual in the eyes of literally everyone but me. Nobody believed this weirdo forest dweller had found me without my brother and his idiot friends, let alone that he'd quote-unquote saved me from a hole that quote-unquote mysteriously couldn't be found. Or at least, that's how the skeptic law enforcement officials and jury sarcastically saw it when he refused to stop pleading his innocence. I could have corroborated his story, but instead Look, I was 12, okay? I was surrounded by furious adults who needed vindication, not inexplicable, not vanishing forest holes. Ben's dad screamed at me so much about Kincaid being a serial killer, about Kincaid doing something so fuck up it traumatized me, about being so traumatized that I'd wiped it from my memory and swapped it for a fantasy, that I believed it. For years I convinced myself that justice had been served, that forest weirdo Simon Kincaid had killed my brother and his two dumbass pals. I couldn't ignore the daily nightmares about the hole or the scream that came from it forever, though. I ended up having an I had a life. A shitty job in data science, a failed marriage that was too short to produce kids, a cat. Not much, but more than Simon Kincaid ever got. Through it all, I had the nightmares to remind me that my empire of mediocrity was built on a fatal lie. It was the mid-2010s when I finally broke and admitted the truth to myself. I decided not to tell Mom and Dad. I wanted to spare them the pain. It had been years since Jamie's casketless funeral. Why open old wounds, I figured. Either they'd think I'd gone mad, or they'd believe me and want to head back to Wisconsin for answers. Both options involved nothing but emotional pain. I couldn't do that to them, although now I wish I'd found the strength to. The guilt at knowing they died ignorant of Jamie's true fate is tearing me apart, almost as much as what I did to Simon Kincaid with my silence. As I said, I'm not posting this to find absolution. I don't deserve forgiveness. I did a terrible thing. I have to live with that fact and own it. I ran from my trauma for years, wrapped myself in the comfort of a reality I knew to be false, and an innocent man died for it. At least I don't have to carry this as a secret anymore. Mom and Dad might be gone, but someone else knows what really happened that day. You, by the way, I'm talking about you, the person reading this. Who knows? Maybe now I've told you the nightmares will finally stop. I hope so. This was the first idea on my list, and I'm really not looking forward to Plan B. Plan A, posting this, hinges on the fact my nightmares are because of the guilt. If they're not, well, shit. I'm really not looking forward to Plan B. I haven't been back to Herbert's Woods since I led the police to Adam's 88 Comanche and the clearing where the hole had been. Somehow I know if I return alone this time, I'll find it again. Deep down in my bones. I know. I don't want to test the theory, though. But if these fucking nightmares don't stop, that's the next step. What else can I do? I need to make it right. Maybe that means finding the bodies. I'm so sorry.